April 17, 1961, Cuba under the heel of Fidel Castro. A band of Cuban exiles vow to free their homeland only to suffer a humiliating defeat. Today, 25 years later, they remember.
I'm Ann Bishop. Now, people who are not even certain where the island of Cuba is situated have heard of the Bay of Pigs. But unless you're closely aligned with the Cuban community, it's hard to understand what actually happened 25 years ago today. How an incredibly brave band of Cuban exiles who loved their homeland waded ashore with hope in their heart, willing to lay down their lives and trying to follow the tradition of Jose Marti to once again bring freedom to the island of Cuba. The Assault Brigade 2506 saw that hope crushed in a humiliating defeat. Lives were lost, hundreds were captured, and the date of April 17, 1961 would live forever in the hearts of all Cubans. A dream of hope turned into a day of agony and a quarter of a century of bitterness and regrets. During the next half hour, we're going to be telling you what happened, why it happened, and how our community has coped with the Bay of Pigs defeat. We'll be remembering the invasion with those who were there.
It's been 25 years since the Bay of Pigs invasion. In fact, the program you are about to see marks the 25th anniversary of that unforgettable date in Cuban history. But to many of us, it seems like only yesterday. So deep are the memories that linger on. On your screen tonight, you will see the story of hundreds of brave men who tried to stop the rule of Castro and communism in Cuba. We at Republic Band feel honored to sponsor this program.
Many people think the invasion plan was designed by Cuban exiles anxious to free their homeland. Well, the exiles were certainly looking for freedom, but the invasion plan was designed and promoted by the CIA many months before any shots were fired. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Ileana Varela.
1960. The Cuban Revolution is merely a year old, but already its leader, Fidel Castro, is surfacing as a menace to the U.S. The CIA has a plan against him. President Dwight D. Eisenhower okays it, and on March 17th, CIA Chief Allen Dulles sets out to form a Cuban exile force. It is all supposed to be top secret, and yet in Miami, Cuban exiles flock to recruiting offices, and only weeks later, Castro himself publicly charges the U.S. is training an army to invade Cuba. Relations between the two countries are not good. In early 1960, the CIA took over the small island of Usepa, just off the coast of Fort Myers. It moved out just about everyone except maintenance crews, and moved in 63 Cuban exiles for training.
This house here to the left was used by some of the American advisors.
This is a place where we had our training in here, radio training, cryptographic training, that is encoding messages and this type of thing.
To fool Cuban intelligence into thinking there were many more, the men are assigned numbers beginning with 2,500. Miami engineer Jose Basulto is given number 2522.
At the time we first came in here, the plan was simply to prepare us to aid, to supply and train the underground in Cuba.
Here they train mostly in radio communications. More serious training takes place in Guatemala, where the CIA is creating an exile infantry and air force. Julio Pestonit was number 3887.
We're took to a farm that belonged to Mr. Alejo. At that time, Mr. Alejo was like a minister of Guatemala. And he owns a big farm on the mountains, and over there we built a camp.
Most of us, all of us, were not military people, and the training was very hard. We used to train almost 8 to 10 hours a day, And due to the conditions of the area, I would say we were well trained.
Julio Gonzalez-Rebull was number 2719. Cuban pilots were trained by retired pilots of the Alabama Air Guard on old B-26 bombers. Eduardo Ferrer, now captain with Eastern Airlines, was Air Force number 2402.
At the beginning, I remember that we have a little problem because of the language, you know. You can imagine Cuban receiving training from an American from Alabama, you know. You all have a good trip here, something like that. My name was not Eddie, but Eddie. But at the end, we more or less feel like brothers.
Back in Havana, Castro faces mounting resistance from the underground and from a guerrilla revolt in the Escambray Mountains. The revolt is crushed, but there is talk of yet another threat, a U.S.-led invasion. On national television, Castro calls for a general mobilization. The country waits to be invaded, and the U.S. breaks off relations with Cuba. It is the end of 1960. Exile troops continue to train in Guatemala, some in Panama. There has already been one casualty. Carlos Rodriguez Santana has fallen 2,000 feet off a cliff in a training hike. His number was 2506. In his honor, the brigade takes the number as its name. 1961, the United States has a new leader, and so do Cuban exiles. Under CIA pressure, exile groups appoint Dr. Jose Miro Cardona to head the new government to be installed by the invasion forces. As D-Day nears, Cuban exiles in Miami sense it. There are more and more volunteers. There are prayers for the men of Brigade 2506, men who are confident they will win.
Who dare to have any doubt about the central intelligence of the greatest country in the world? We were in the hand of the CIA. So, I, for once, was blind.
The men of Brigade 2506 were ready to liberate their homeland, but the go-ahead would have to come from the new man in the White House. And
when there is a change in administration in our country, there is sometimes a change in foreign policy. But when the mantle was passed from Dwight D. Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy, everybody knew how President Kennedy felt about a free Cuba. He had made that a strong campaign issue. But would he support a CIA Cuban exile invasion plan? Here's Eyewitness News reporter Jack Rotholz.
Well, first I want to say that there will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces.
It was a campaign promise that would never be kept. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, stumping for votes, seen by some as soft on communism. But 1 month before the election, October 1960, candidate Kennedy publicly calls for U.S. aid to Cuban rebels in an effort to defeat Castro. Privately, it infuriates his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, who claims Kennedy is threatening the security of the United States. Unknown to Kennedy, the plot was already being hatched by the CIA under President Eisenhower, a plan that included not only the invasion of Cuba, but the assassination of Castro.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
But before the plan could be carried out, Kennedy won the election and inherited the CIA plot to overthrow the communist regime in Cuba. In numerous meetings with top advisors and the CIA, Kennedy expressed doubts about the operation. But CIA Chief Allen Dulles, a holdover from the Eisenhower administration, assured him it would work. Advisors like Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who privately were opposed to the invasion, stood silent. So on April 14th, Kennedy picked up the phone, called the CIA, and ordered airstrikes on Cuba the next day, April 15th, 2 days before the actual invasion. But still, Kennedy had doubts. Grayson Lynch was a CIA agent back then, the American commander in charge of the invasion force. Today, he is retired and living in Tampa.
The brigade was told by a personal representative of the president, we will give you full support and continue to supply you with ammunition until you're able to operate on your own. But what happened was that the president ordered a portion of the brigade, which was the air section, to stand down. Don't attack Castro's planes.
The reason for the presidential reversal was because the first airstrike created a furor at the United Nations. Within hours of the bombing, Cuban Foreign Minister Raul Roa was accusing the American government, not Cuban exiles, of instigating an attempted coup.
The responsibility for this act of imperialistic piracy falls squarely on the government of the United States.
U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, uninformed of the CIA plot, denied any U.S. involvement.
No United States personnel participate. No United States government airplanes of any kind participate.
The statement later proved to be false, and with international protest rising, President Kennedy now had another decision to make: call off or continue a second airstrike over Cuba. Kennedy canceled it. Meanwhile, the 2506 Brigade was already on its way to the Bay of Pigs. David Walters was a young international lawyer back then, with many clients in Cuba. He was also a friend of John Kennedy. Today, Walters says the Kennedy operation was doomed to failure. Only under Eisenhower was there a chance to rescue Cuba.
This was a weakness of Eisenhower, even though he was a general. When they seized American property, we were putting Americans in jail. That was the right time for the Bay of Pigs.
Although many blame the CIA and the State Department, in the end, Kennedy accepted full responsibility.
This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.
It was to be the first foreign policy mistake of the young Kennedy administration. It was also where the president learned some valuable lessons about dealing with the Cubans and the Russians. But they were costly lessons. And it was a sign of weakness in the U.S. government that nearly led to World War III 1 year later in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ann?
Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had absolutely no idea how deeply the CIA had plunged into the invasion plan. No one ever gave him the information. It was a classic case of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. And it was going to get worse.
There's only one thing in the world that makes me feel this way. My one and only. The one and only checking account makes me feel wealthy and independent, and like someone really cares about me, because the one and only checking account does all these things for me. Interest-earning checking, a line of credit, Visa Classic or MasterCard, Republimatic card.
Of course, there's only one bank where you can get the one and only checking account, Republic National Bank. You'll find one near you.
The date of the invasion was April 17th. The plans had been laid for quite some time. The Cuban exiles were eager, anxious to bring freedom to their homeland. But it all began to go wrong a couple of days before the 17th. Here's Eyewitness News reporter John Scott.
April 15th, dawn in Havana. The Brigade's Air Force attacks, trying to wipe out Castro's planes on the ground. Nearly everything is destroyed, except 3 training jets, jets that would prove critical in the coming invasion. The Brigade pilots planned to get them the next day. 2 more airstrikes are still scheduled, but those strikes never happened. They were canceled by President Kennedy.
But we knew that we never took out the Castro Air Force. That was the main objective of those air attacks. And then the one of the 60 was canceled. They never let us fly again back to Cuba and try to finish the job we didn't do it on the 15th.
April 17th, 2 days after the airstrike, Brigade 2506 lands at the Bay of Pigs. But the first man to hit the beach at Playa Larga is not a Cuban. He's an American, CIA Brigade leader Grayson Lynch.
Yeah, that was not really planned that way. Time was running short. There was a big black area in there behind the beach with woods there. Could have a brigade in there for all I knew. So I simply joined the frogmen and make a quick run in there to see whether there were anybody there. We ran into a Cuban militia jeep that saw us, turned his headlights on us. We had to shoot him up and checked the area out. There was nobody there. We ordered the brigade to land. So accidentally, I was the first to fire and the first to land.
The attack was so poorly coordinated that a brigade member working underground in Cuba as a radio operator wasn't told it was coming. He is Javier Souto, a Florida state representative.
So it was April 17th already, and I went to sleep. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock, the people and 2 old ladies I was living in this apartment with 2 old ladies. They woke me up and say, hey, my name was Servando, my code name, Servando. We are listening to the Radio Swan radio, and they're saying that the invasion is taking place. And I said, that can't be.
Castro reacted by arming civilians, taking personal command of his troops and sending them to meet the invasion.
From a military standpoint of view, it doesn't look logical that 1,500 people could fight an army that Castro had at that time on arms over 500,000 people.
But what the invasion force was counting on was air support, its own fleet of 12 B-26s, and possibly direct help from U.S. aircraft carriers.
So we flew over the Essex, the carrier Essex. It had 50 airplanes inside. I saw 4 or 5 destroyers. I remember that my co-pilot told me, we can't lose. We have the United States Navy backing us.
The air support never came. 5 of the old, slow B-26s were shot down, sitting ducks for the Castro jets that survived the airfield attack. The ground troops were in trouble. The jets sank their communications ship and their 2 supply ships, leaving them no food and, more important, no bullets.
We got ammunition, all that we need for training, we got it. But on the beach, we never saw that ammunition anymore.
With no air threat above, Castro's troops were free to bring in tanks and heavy guns.
Some of the tanks of Castro, they already were blocking the lines and taking prisoners. And then we came to a dock close to the beach, and we saw a small fishing boat over there, and we jumped in the water and swim to the boat.
He is one of the few who escaped. Hundreds of the brigade did not. For 2 days they fought until finally, outgunned and outmanned, they were surrounded, still waiting for the help they thought was coming from America.
We never saw that we were going to lose. We never were prepared to lose the battle.
And I was there when Mr. San Roman, Jose San Roman, our head of the brigade, tried to talk to the mothership or headquarters of the invasion, American headquarters. And I hear the message, and nobody told me. I hear very clear, and I still got it in my mind what they say. They say, our heart is with you, but Big Boss say no. Good luck.
As a military operation, it was a dismal failure. In just 2 days, 114 brigade members died. 1,189 were taken captive. 2 of them are still in Cuban jails today. For Fidel Castro, a decisive military victory. For the United States, worldwide humiliation. Ann?
The defeat was overwhelming. The men of the brigade couldn't believe it. The Cuban exiles couldn't believe that they wouldn't soon be going home to a free Cuba. The United States was humiliated, standing in disgrace in the eyes of the world. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Ileana Varela.
The battle of the Bay of Pigs was not lost in Cuba. It was lost in Washington before the battle ever began.
I've said from the beginning the operation was a failure and that the responsibility rests with the White House.
Among those wounded and captured at Bay of Pigs, former Florida State Representative Humberto Cortina. Cortina was shot through the legs and could not walk for a year.
We were constantly attacked. We could constantly worked mentally, even though you can't say that we were hit every day. They would take us out at 2 in the morning naked and throw water at us.
The prisoners were moved to Havana for televised mass trials in which the men say they were pressured to implicate the U.S.
During the trials, none of us, when the trials were there, even though the government wanted us to fault the United States, we all stood up and said, no, we were not going to fault the United States, that they were not responsible. This was our war to liberate our country.
That was the darkest day of my life. I'll never forget that day. I saw my friends and my companions, the ones that had trained with me in Guatemala. I saw them in TV being interrogated and humiliated by the communists.
Basulto, who had been training the underground, managed to escape capture by jumping the fence into Guantanamo base. Another group escaped on a small fishing boat. Julio Pestonit was on that boat.
No provisions at all. We were a group of 22 men, and 10 of them died. No water, no food. We spent on the ocean 16 days.
Back in the U.S., Cuban exiles refused to forget the prisoners. About a year later, Castro offered to trade the men for a $62 million ransom. He finally settled for $56 million, $3 million cash, the rest in food and medicine. New York lawyer James Donovan led the negotiating team, but the deal did not include freedom for brigade members who had infiltrated Cuba before the invasion and were caught working for the underground. Those were either executed or, like Jorge Gutierrez, served long jail sentences.
I spent in San Severino prison 8 months waiting night after night to be shot. And after 8 months, they commuted the sentence to 30 years in prison.
How many did you serve?
18. Well, to be exactly 17 years, 9 months, and 11 days.
Finally, some of the wounded were let go, but the big release came the day before Christmas 1962. More than 5,000 relatives jammed a converted hangar at Homestead Air Force Base for the welcome. It had been almost 2 years since the ill-fated battle. The following Saturday, President Kennedy paid a personal welcome at the Orange Bowl. He was presented with the brigade flag, which had flown for 3 days over Playa Girón. Most of the men did not yet know it had been Kennedy who had refused the much-needed air support. CIA agent Grayson Lynch, the American commander of the invasion force, remembers the day well.
You mean the day that it snowed in Miami? Snowstorm, snow job in the Orange Bowl?
Mm-hmm. And I feel very proud that I never went to the Orange Bowl because I didn't believe it, because I was on the beach when he betrayed us and said that he's not gonna help us.
I'm still angry. I feel betrayed by Kennedy.
Eduardo Ferrer was at the Orange Bowl when Kennedy made a big promise to the brigade, one he could not keep.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But President Kennedy was assassinated, and the brigade flag ended up in a wooden crate at the Kennedy Museum in Massachusetts. In fact, the brigade had to go to court to get the flag back, and now, except for special occasions, it sits in a bank vault in Miami. It is tucked away, but not forgotten, just like the brigade's dreams of victory someday. Anne?
Today, the Brigade Monument in Little Havana is a gathering place. Casual meetings, memorials, protests. But this piece of iron and stone watches over the dreams of today. And in 25 years, those dreams have broadened. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Nery Ynclan.
Signs that many Cubans in Miami keep the dream alive are seen at demonstrations like these.
Estados Unidos y Cuba, hasta hace...
Influential Spanish-language radio stations can bring together thousands of exiles in hours to protest or commemorate any event that smacks of Cuba or communism. But what about the young Cubans, children born here who know of Cuba only what their parents have told them?
We came to Miami High because it's in the heart of Little Havana. Cuban students we talked to here had different ideas about the Bay of Pigs, and some had no idea what we were talking about.
Do you think the young Cubans feel more American than they do Cuban?
No, it's just that some of them don't even have an interest in there. Like, they didn't lose anything when they left, so they wouldn't gain anything by going back.
Do you think that young Cubans today would go back and fight for Cuba, would you?
No, I don't think so, no.
Do you know what the Bay of Pigs was about?
No. Bay of Pigs? What's about?
Do you know what the Bay of Pigs was about?
The what?
The Bay of Pigs invasion?
No.
FIU professor Antonio Jorge says first-generation Cuban Americans are still very close to the past.
Of course, the first-generation Cubans would be less committed
obviously to Cuba than their parents were. And some of them, I think, more than others, probably those who were more directly influenced by their parents, perhaps because their parents participated directly in military events and so on and so forth, would be willing to follow in the footsteps of their parents.
At the University of Miami, where most students are worried about final exams and getting jobs, we found some who said they would go to war for Cuba.
Would you go and fight to free Cuba now?
I think, yeah, I would. Because it means a lot to my parents, and plus it's a very big part of my life.
Because of my mother and father and the ties back then, I know the ties are very strong for them. And if it meant that much to them, maybe, yeah.
I think that a lot of them would be willing to invest in an invasion. I don't know how many would be actually willing to put their life on the line for it. I myself, perhaps.
For many young Cubans, talk of liberating Cuba was nothing more than the emotional hysteria of older exiles. But the conservative tone of the Reagan administration and troubles in Central America have refocused attention on the communist threat. Many young Cubans are reevaluating the stories their parents have told them. And
many of the people who worked so hard for the Bay of Pigs invasion are gone now, but they've passed on the dream. The new generation, many of whom have never set foot on Cuban soil, have very special feelings for the land of their heritage. But they think of themselves as Americans. Their dedication now is to this country. Oh, they still dream about freedom, but they dream about it for everyone, for all men and women. They dream that someday Cuba and all countries will live in freedom. I'm Ann Bishop.
For a few hours, victory seemed possible. Then, suddenly, the invasion brigade was abandoned. Communism had secured a beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. Had the invasion at the Bay of Pigs succeeded, this part of the world would be a different place to live today. We at Republic Bank dedicate this program to the courageous men of Brigade 2506 who risked their life to free Cuba from communism. May God bless them and those who pay the supreme sacrifice. We will never forget them, never.
This Channel 10 special presentation has been brought to you by Republic National Bank of Miami.